let's get started on neurons. Let's just dive right into it. So what are neurons? They are a nerve cell that sends electrochemical messages. It allows us to sense the world, so everything that we feel and touch and see. It allows us to transmit and process information and produce a response. So basically, everything that we really do kind of requires a neuron. So let's look at the structure of a neuron. When I see a neuron, I kind of see a tree, and I see the dendrites as the branches, and then the axon as the trunk, and the axon terminals as its roots. So maybe that will help you. So like I said, the branch-looking structure right here, those are dendrites. And then that big kind of circular mass right there is the cell body, and that green thing is a nucleus. So it's a cell, it requires a nucleus. Then we see the axon. That's that long trail, kind of the trunk, and it has these bulbs kind of right there. Those are called myelin, which we'll get into their function. And there's also a Schwann cell on top. Okay, so Schwann cells produce myelin, so they are close together. Then in between, you could see there's a little gap between the myelin and the node of Ranvier, or the myelin and another myelin, and that little gap is a node of Ranvier. So there's myelin, the node, and then there's another myelin sheath. Okay, and then at the end there is the axon terminal. So that's where neurotransmitters are released. Okay, and we'll get into that. So again, the parts. So the dendrites, the branches, they receive the chemical signals. They receive neurotransmitters from their neighboring cells. So the cells are really close to each other, and it goes from the end of the axon terminal of one neuron. Then there are neurotransmitters that kind of release onto the next neuron's dendrites. Okay, so that might be confusing, but we will dive into it. So again, dendrites receive that chemical signal from its neighboring cells. Okay, and then the cell body, and also known as the soma, contains the nucleus, and it also contains the organelles that are needed for a cell, because right, a neuron is a cell. And then there's an axon. Remember that trunk? That's the long extension. It carries electrical messages away from the body of the axon terminals to the axon terminals. So it goes from the dendrites. The axons carry the electrical messages, and then that to the axon terminals. Okay, and then there's axon terminals, which passes that signal on at the branch, and it's the end of the axon. Okay, so the dendrites receive that chemical signal. The cell body is containing the nucleus and the organelles. The axon is carrying that electrical message, and the axon terminals are passing that signal on to the next neuron. Okay, and then there's this thing called synaptic vesicles. Those are sacs, little tiny sacs in the axon terminals that contain the neurotransmitters that allows it to release those neurotransmitters, those signals. Okay, so just remember the direction of the signal transmission is from the dendrites all the way down to the axon terminal. Okay, so there are more parts. There's the myelin sheath, which we talked about. That's the protective covering for the axon. It also helps speed up the impulses. Okay, so there's myelin sheath, and then in between are the nodes of Ranvier. Again, that's the gap in the myelin sheath, and that also helps rapid conduction of the nerve impulses. So without the myelin sheath, there would be no nodes of Ranvier. Therefore, it would go, the impulse would go slower. Then there's Schwann cells, which are producing myelin sheath. They're a type of glial cells. And just remember what a glial cell is. That's it's not a neuron, so it's non-neuronal cells in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and they don't produce electrical impulses. They maintain homeostasis, they form myelin, and they provide support and protection. Okay. So Schwann cells are a type of glial cells that produce myelin sheath. Okay, so like I was saying, impulse travels much faster with myelin sheath and nodes of Ranvier. So if we look at this image, you see that once you have a stimulus, the stimulus goes from the dendrites to the axon terminals, and without the myelin sheath, it's taking a slow amount of time. Well, it's still kind of fast, but it's much slower than when it's produced with myelinated neurons. Okay, so I think these two GIFs are an accurate depiction of it. It really kind of shows you what is happening. Okay, so there are three different types of neurons. There's the sensory neuron, which detect the stimuli, so they're close to the skin, and they are detecting the stimuli. Okay. Then there's interneurons, which relay the sensory signals from the sensory neuron back to the motor neurons. Okay, and then there's motor neurons, which produce the muscle response. Okay, so the sensory neuron, they're picking up the stimulus. The interneurons are kind of like the messenger from, like the third messenger, kind of. They're relaying that signal back to, from the brain and back to the motor neurons. Okay. And then the motor neurons produce that response. Okay, one more time. The sensory neuron detects the stimulus. The interneuron goes back and relays the message to the brain and then back to the motor neurons, where the motor neurons produce a response. Okay, and then at the synapse of a neuron, that's where neurotransmitters are released. So remember that sac in the axon terminals, neurotransmitters are released from there through the synaptic vesicles, and then they cross the synapse. So the synapse is between the axon terminals of one neuron and then at the dendrites of another neuron. So in between those two are the synapse. So there, a signal is transferred, those neurotransmitters are crossing, and they match with the receptors for the correct receptors on the dendrite. Okay, just a few types of neurotransmitters. There's endorphins, which produce a euphoria feeling, dopamine, which produces pleasure, serotonin helps with mood, and adrenaline is your fight or flight neurotransmitter. Okay, so how are these signals actually traveling? That's due to the resting and action potential. So the rise and fall of a voltage in its membrane is the axon potential. So that's how a signal travels. So at rest, it's called a resting potential. So when there's no impulse, there's a negative charge inside the cell, and then outside the fluid of the cell, there's a positive charge. So that's its resting potential. And you can see that in these two GIFs. Okay, so at rest, it's negative inside the cell. Outside the cell, it is positive. Okay, and then when depolarization occurs, that's when signals from the dendrites reach the axon. And when that happens, as you can see right here, sodium ions enter in the cell and kind of flip that negative and positive charge. Okay, and then repolarization occurs when these channels close, so the sodium channels close and then the potassium channels open, which brings the change back to a negative on the inside and positive on the outside. Okay, so that's repolarization. It's going back to how it was. So a negative on the inside of the cell and a positive on the outside of the cell. Okay, so depolarization is changing. Those channels are opening, the Na ions are entering into the cell, making it negative. So it's kind of like flipping the charges, and then repolarization brings that kind of back to normal. Okay, and this can result in hyperpolarization. So that means the inside is even more negative than it was before. And we'll look at that in a graph because it's kind of easier to see it that way, at least in my opinion. Okay, so when that signal travels, okay, so it's traveling, and then all of a sudden there's a stimulus, and that causes depolarization. That means the channels are, the sodium ions are inside the cell, meaning that it will go to positive on the inside, negative on the outside, and then it will go back to repolarization when the potassium channels open. So the potassium ions are out, so it's going back to a negative voltage, and then sometimes it goes into hyperpolarization and then a resting state. Okay, so that's all we had for neurons. I hope this helped, and I will see you soon.